finding the right doctor makes all the difference in the world. So finding that doctor that you're comfortable with, um, and that you have a good rapport with, and um, just makes 310% huge difference. Whether they don't necessarily have to be at a um, uh, research hospital or amazing hospital. I mean, obviously that would be that would be great, but just because someone's telling you to go to this certain hospital and you might not find a doctor there that you like. My name is Wyatt. I was diagnosed with stage 4 non-small cell lung cancer with a mutation of KRAS G12D in January of 2021. I live in Chicago, Illinois. If my friends and family could describe me, they would probably say I would talk to anybody. And I'm very resilient. I'm very creative. Um, and I'm very passionate about what I put my heart and soul into. I was born with hydrocephalus, so I have a shunt that drains the fluid off my brain. So leading up to all of this, I was having migraines pretty periodically, probably once every other month or so, that were lasting about a week, maybe 2 weeks, that were like debilitating. I was throwing up. I was like just laying in bed, like I was taking a week or so off of work. Um, it was getting pretty bad. My husband would take me to the emergency room. They would take a CT of my head, and they would just send me home. Like we just kept repeating this process, and then I think it was Thanksgiving of 2020. We went to Tennessee for to see my family, and I had a migraine going up, leading into going down there. Um, And while we were there, I passed out a couple times. So my mom and family were concerned, obviously. So they called an ambulance and sent me to the emergency room. And they again sent me home. They were like, "You're fine." Um, so come back to Chicago, and I ended up losing sight in one of my eyes, and my hands clamped up. Um, so it was getting pretty scary. So my husband kind of just dropped me off at the emergency room because it was COVID times, so he couldn't come in with me. And this time we went to the emergency room with my where my neurologist was. And my neurologist took one look at me and he was like, "We got to replace your shunt." So they did. They replaced my shunt, and they did a CAT scan again to make sure everything was in the right place. And they did a CAT scan from my head down to my chest this time, to make sure it goes in the right place because it runs down to my stomach. And they saw lesions on my lungs. And they were like, "Oh, you have an infection on your in your lungs." And I was like, "Okay." And I remember the doctor telling me, she was like, "Oh, don't worry, it's not cancer or anything. It's just an infection. We're going to get rid of it." So I sat in the hospital for 2 weeks trying to get rid of this infection, um, and it still wasn't going away. So they did a biopsy, and they were like, "Okay, well, we'll send you home, and we'll send the results to your PCP." So a couple weeks later, I went to my PCP, and he was like, "I don't have anything." So my PCP, I was good friends with him at the time. He called around to the hospital, and I don't know who he talked to or how he found the results, but he finally came back in the room like a couple hours later, and he was like, "It's stage 4 lung cancer." Um, so it's kind of out of nowhere. The migraines I don't feel like are a typical symptom of lung cancer, but um, that's kind of how I found it. It kind of hit me out of left field. So I just sat there in that doctor's office for a while and cried for a minute or a while, a while. And I had a friend who worked at the front desk, so I went and grabbed my friend Jose at the time, and um, I sat there with him for a bit. Um, and then later that day, I went home, and my husband knew I was going to get the results, so I sat him at the foot of the bed, and I told him that it was stage 4 lung cancer, and we both just sat there in silence. I don't think either one of us knew what to say, or what emotions to even feel at that point, or what to expect, or what was coming, or what we didn't really know what to expect or what to do. Um, I had never really dealt with anything like that. My grandma had passed away of cancer like 3 or 4 years before that, but she lived in Tennessee and I was in Chicago at the time, so I didn't really have to deal with her cancer or anything. So I've never really had to deal with that. My husband at the time, his mom had breast cancer twice, and so he had dealt with that. So he kind of had some kind of cancer experience, I guess. But I had never had anything like that before. Um, I didn't know what was in store. The first thing I needed to figure out was I needed to find insurance. um, so at the time, I was working as a contract employee, or self-employed, I guess. So I was able to quote unquote work the system and qualify for Medicaid, um, which I didn't know at the time was going to be a lifesaver. um, So I've been on Medicaid, Medicare's for the past 3 or 4.5 years. Um, so once I finally figured that out, and which was confusing and crazy, and the whole Medicaid, Medicare, all of that is very confusing. But once I finally figured that out, I my first appointment was with a GI oncologist, because they told me that my the biopsy came back and said that the cancer might be in my lungs, but it was showing that it was came from my GI tract. So they sent me to a GI oncologist. So they made me do a endoscopy and a colonoscopy and all these other tests, and sent me to this GI oncologist. And I was terrified, and she was very cold, and uh, just her demeanor, her bedside manner was very different than my later oncologist. Um, and you had to go by yourself because it was COVID, so it was just a very different experience. Um, but once they did all those tests, they didn't find it anywhere else, so I went later to my thoracic oncologist, um, which he was, I feel like, much more helpful. Or I guess I responded to her bedside manner a little bit better. I've spoken to a couple of different oncologists. I've gotten a second opinion. Even with, I'm also HIV positive, so I've had a lot of experience with different doctors, and a lot of doctors who I didn't click with, or doctors who don't want to take the time to either speak with me because I'm HIV positive. Finding the right doctor makes all the difference in the world. So finding that doctor that you're comfortable with, um, and that you have a good rapport with, and um, just makes 310% huge difference. Whether they don't necessarily have to be at a um, uh, research hospital or amazing hospital. I mean, obviously that would be that would be great, but just because someone's telling you to go to this certain hospital, and you might not find a doctor there that you like. So if for some reason that doctor is at a community hospital and you find that doctor that you're got a good rapport with, that's the one I would probably go with, because you're going to listen to them, and um, you're going to trust them a lot more. Self-advocacy has come in. It took me a minute to get my legs with this. I feel like I've always had to self-advocate in other ways prior to lung cancer, but when I jumped into this, I didn't know anything about lung cancer. So you come into this with a zero knowledge about anything cancer-wise, and then like you go in and expecting the doctors to, you're looking at them as the source of knowledge and the source of everything, and then you kind of learn that they're only human, and they don't know your body, and they don't know you, and what you're wanting, and what your values are. So you kind of have to you have to advocate for yourself. I had I don't know, maybe a year and a half in, I was throwing up and throwing up and throwing up. Like everything I was eating just wasn't staying down. And I kept telling my PA at the time, like, I'm throwing up. And she's like, well, take your nausea medicine, take your nausea medicine. And I was like, it's not helping. And I was getting really, really frustrated, to the point where, like, I only saw my oncologist I see her at scan reviews like every 3 months. So finally, I made a calendar, and every time I would eat something, I would write it down and I would circle it if I threw it up. And I showed my oncologist how much I was throwing up, and she was like, "Oh my gosh, why didn't you tell me?" And I was like, "I don't see you." I was so frustrated, and at that point, I filed a complaint with the hospital, and I was like, "I don't want to see this PA anymore. I'm not seeing this PA anymore." So at that point, I was like, I'm only seeing my oncologist because she's not listening to me. Um, and you'd have to advocate for yourself. And I think that's at that point where I was just like, these doctors and people are only human. You have to advocate for yourself. They don't know what's going on outside of these doctors' doors. So I mean, you have to stand up for yourself.